Hello, everybody. This is Mike History 2, and we're continuing the series on Stalin versus Trotsky. So, in the post war period, there were often shortages in Soviet cities, and the Soviet Union experienced a major famine from 1946 to 1947. Sparked by drought and ensuing bad harvest in 1946, it was worsened by government policy towards food organization, including the state's decision to export food rather than actually distributing it to famine hit areas. Sounds very familiar. Certain United Kingdom also did that a lot. Anyways, 1 to 1.5 million people died. While agricultural production stagnated, Stalin focused on a series of major infrastructure projects, because that's your biggest priority in the famine, including the construction of hydroelectric plants, canals, and railway lines running to the north. Much of this was constructed by prisoners. After World War II, the United Kingdom declined, leaving the United States and the Soviet Union as the dominant world powers. Tensions among these former allies grew, resulting in the Cold War. Though Stalin publicly described the United Kingdom and the United States as being aggressive, he thought it was unlikely that a war with them would happen, believing that several decades of peace was likely. He nevertheless secretly intensified Soviet research into nuclear weaponry, intent on creating an atomic bomb. He personally took an interest in the development of the weapon, and in August 1949, the bomb was successfully tested in the deserts outside Semipalatinsk. Stalin also started a new military buildup, and the Soviet army was expanded from 2.9 million soldiers in 1949 to 5.8 million by 1953. The United States began pushing its interests on every continent, getting air force bases in Africa and Asia, and ensuring pro-American regimes took power across Latin America. It launched the Marshall Plan in June 1947, with which it sought to undermine Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. The Allies demanded that Stalin withdraw the Red Army from northern Iran, which he did in April 1947. Stalin also tried to maximize Soviet influence on the world stage, unsuccessfully pushing for the newly independent Libya to become a Soviet protectorate. He sent Molotov as his representative to San Francisco to take part in negotiations to form the United Nations, insisting that the Soviet Union have a place on the Security Council. In April 1949, the Western powers established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an international military alliance of capitalist countries. Within Western countries, Stalin was increasingly portrayed as the most evil dictator alive and compared to Hitler. In 1949, celebrations took place to mark Stalin's 70th birthday, even though his birthday had actually been 1 year earlier, at which Stalin attended an event in the Bolshoi Theater alongside communist leaders from across Europe and Asia. After the war, Stalin sought to retain Soviet dominance across Eastern Europe while expanding its influence in Asia. Cautious regarding the responses from the Western Allies, Stalin avoided immediately installing Communist Party governments across Eastern Europe, instead initially ensuring that communists were placed in coalition ministries. In contrast to his approach to the Baltic states, he rejected the proposal of merging these states into the Soviet Union, rather recognizing them as independent countries. He was faced by the problem that there were few communists left in Eastern Europe, most having been killed by the Nazis. Demanded that war reparations be paid by Germany and its allies Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia. Churchill had observed that an iron curtain had been drawn across Europe, separating the East from the West. In September 1947, a meeting of East European communist leaders was held in Śląska Poręba, Poland, which then formed Common Forum to coordinate the communist parties across Eastern Europe and also in France and Italy. Stalin did not personally attend the meeting, sending Zdanov in its place. Various Eastern European communists also visited Stalin in Moscow. There he offered advice on their ideas. For instance, he cautioned against the Yugoslav idea for Balkan Federation incorporating Bulgaria and Albania. Stalin also had a particularly strained relationship with Yugoslav leader Joseph Broz Tito, due to the latter's continuous calls for Balkan Federation and for Soviet aid for the communist forces in the ongoing Greek Civil War. In March 1948, Stalin launched an anti-Tito campaign accusing the Yugoslav communists of adventurism and deviating from communist doctrine. The Second Common Forum Conference, held in Bucharest in June 1948, East European communist leaders all denounced Tito's government, accusing them of being fascists and agents of Western capitalism. Stalin ordered several assassination attempts on Tito's life and even thought about invading Yugoslavia. Stalin suggested that a unified but demilitarized German state should be established, hoping that it would either come under Soviet influence or remain neutral. The United States and the United Kingdom remained opposed to this. Stalin sought to force their hand by blockading Berlin in June 1948. He gambled that the others would not risk war, but they airlifted supplies into western Berlin until May 1949, when Stalin gave in and ended the blockade. In September 1949, the Western powers created West Germany, so the Soviet Union created East Germany in October. In accordance with the earlier agreements, the Western powers expected Poland to become an independent state with free democratic elections. In Poland, the Soviets merged various socialist parties into the Polish United Workers' Party, and vote rigging was used to ensure that it secured office. The 1947 Hungarian elections were also rigged, with the Hungarian Working People's Party taking control. Czechoslovakia, where the communists did have a level of popular support, they were elected as the largest party in 1946. Across Eastern Europe, the Soviet model was enforced with the termination of political pluralism, agricultural collectivization, and investment in heavy industry, and monarchies were removed from power in Romania and Bulgaria. In October 1949, Mao Zedong took power in China. With this accomplished, communist governments now controlled a third of the world. Stalin, a former gangster and prisoner, had now become the second most powerful person on earth, who controlled directly or indirectly one-third of the world. Privately, Stalin revealed that he had underestimated the Chinese communists and their ability to win the Civil War, instead encouraging them to make another peace with the Kuomintang. In December 1949, Mao visited Stalin. Initially, Stalin refused to repeal the Sino-Soviet Treaty of 1945, which significantly benefited the Soviet Union over China. Well, in January 1950, he gave him and agreed to sign a new treaty between the two countries. Stalin was concerned that Mao might follow Tito's example by pursuing a course independent of Soviet influence, and made it known that if displeased, he would withdraw assistance from China, but the Chinese desperately needed this assistance after decades of civil war. After World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States divided up Korea, formerly part of Japan, along the 38th parallel, setting up a communist government in the north and a pro-Western government in the south. North Korean leader Kim Seong-ju, better known as Kim Il-sung, visited Stalin in March 1949 and again in March 1950. He wanted to invade the south, and although Stalin was initially reluctant to provide support, he eventually agreed by May 1950. The North Korean army launched the Korean War by invading the south in June 1950, making swift gains and capturing Seoul. Both Stalin and Mao believed that a swift victory would follow. The United States went to the United Nations Security Council, where the Soviet Union was boycotting over its refusal to recognize Mao's government, and secured military support for the South Koreans. American-led forces pushed the North Koreans back. Stalin wanted to avoid direct Soviet conflict with the United States, convincing China to help the North. The Soviet Union was one of the first nations to recognize the newly independent Israel in 1948. When the Israeli ambassador Golda Meir arrived in the Soviet Union, Stalin was angered by the Jewish crowds who gathered to greet her. He was further angered by Israel's growing alliance with the United States. After Stalin fell out with Israel, he launched an anti-Jewish campaign within the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. Soviet press engaged in attacks on Zionism, Jewish culture, with growing levels of anti-Semitism being expressed across Soviet society. Stalin's increasing tolerance of anti-Semitism may have stemmed from his increasing Russian nationalism, or from the recognition that anti-Semitism had proved a useful mobilizing tool for Hitler, even though Stalin apparently was against anti-Semitism anyways, and that he could do the same. He may have increasingly viewed the Jewish people as a counter-revolutionary nation whose members were loyal to the United States. In his later years, Stalin was in poor health. He took increasingly long holidays in 1950, and again in 1951 he spent almost 5 months vacationing at his Abkhazian mansion because, equality, right? Stalin nevertheless mistrusted his doctors, and in January 1952 he had one in prison after they suggested that he should retire to improve his health. In September 1952, several Kremlin doctors were arrested for allegedly plotting to kill senior politicians in what came to be known as a doctor's plot, and the majority of the accused were, unsurprisingly, Jewish. He instructed the arrested doctors to be tortured to ensure confession. In November, the Slansky trial took place in Czechoslovakia as 13 senior Communist Party figures, 11 of them Jewish, were accused and convicted of being part of a vast Zionist American conspiracy to subvert Eastern Bloc governments. That same month, a trial of accused Jewish industrial workers took place in Ukraine. In 1951, he initiated the Mingrelian Affair, a purge of the Georgian branch of the Communist Party, which resulted in over 11,000 deportations. From 1946 until his death, Stalin only gave 3 public speeches, 2 of which lasted only a few minutes. The amount of written material that he produced also declined. In October 1952, Stalin gave an hour-and-a-half speech at the Central Committee plenum. There he emphasized what he regarded as leadership qualities necessary in the future. I wonder what those are, and highlighted the weaknesses of various potential successors, particularly Molotov and Mikoyan. In 1952, he also eliminated the Politburo and replaced it with a larger version, which he called a Presidium. On March 1st, 1953, Stalin's staff found him semi-conscious on the bedroom floor at his Volinsko mansion. Once again, equality for everyone. He had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, and he was moved onto a couch and remained there for 3 days. He was hand-fed using a spoon, given various medicines and injections, and leeches were applied to him. Svetlana and Vasily were called to the mansion on March 2nd, but Vasily was drunk and angrily shouted at the doctors, resulting in him being sent home. Stalin finally died on March 5th, 1953. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage, and he had also suffered from severe damage to cerebral arteries due to atherosclerosis. In total, Stalin only caused the deaths of 7.8 to 14 million people. And so now let's all take a moment of silence to remember this great man.